Now, as restrictions are slowly being lifted in Ireland, many people may be feeling anxious about going outside, away from the safety of their home and returning to normal life.
For some, these fears will be temporary, but for others, coronaphobia can affect the quality of your life. And here to discuss more is life coach Mark Fennell. Mark, you're very welcome to the show. Good morning to you.
Good morning, and thanks for having me, guys.
Mark, can we start by asking you the difference between, let's say, coronaphobia and, I would imagine, a little bit of fear, anxiety and concern and trepidation most of us would have about, going back into society, because there is a big difference.
Absolutely. And I think for all of us, we've all got an element of anxiety right now. We had anxiety going into lockdown. We've then had to readjust to lockdown. And now the thoughts of coming out of lockdown, there is going to be anxiety for all of us. But I suppose when it comes to coronaphobia, it's more of a phobia. So it is when, I suppose, it goes beyond the normal levels of anxiety of the new norm, as we call it. It's almost like agoraphobia. It's almost like sociophobia, because, it's not that we're fear of people, but it's the fear of getting coronavirus. So much so where it's almost debilitating, but almost where we don't want to leave the home. We don't want to go anywhere. So it's beyond the levels of normal anxiety, and it's where it affects your quality of life.
And I'd imagine, Mark, people who would tend to suffer with their nerves in terms of going out before the coronavirus might be tempted to put a name on this now, would they, and say, well, it's down to, they're blaming their inactivity, or they don't want to go out of the house now because of the COVID-19. What are the signs? What should we be looking out for?
Yeah, absolutely. And when I say phobia, because this can happen, people who have obviously, if they're an anxious person anyway, but it's almost like, say, for example, arachnophobia. It's not that you're necessarily an anxious person, but you're extremely anxious when there's a spider present. So it can be just something that kicks off when you're amongst people or wherever you deem as a possibility of getting COVID-19. Some of the symptoms to look for, and look, we're probably guilty of some of these symptoms, but when you're guilty of a few of these things, that's when you need to kind of have a look at it. And for example, avoiding hospitals and GPs, like obviously we're not able to go out, the freedom of movement is still restricted. But when you're avoiding a hospital visit, that's important. Avoiding going to a GP. Or, for example, if you're avoiding going to somewhere where you need to go for your own health or for other reasons, that's when you can say, look, the fear is holding you back. The fear is starting to elevate too much. Or, for example, if you've got constant feeling of anxiety. And I think a lot of people right now have that anxiety about there's so much going on in our lives, routines flipped on their heads. It's really, really hard to keep an even keel. However, when you're getting this constant unease, so, you're not being able to focus as much as normal. Maybe there's a constant ruminating. Maybe it's constantly in your mind that I'm back to work next week. I just keep thinking about the office and this sense of dread. If it's affecting your sleep, your eating, if that's disturbed, the knot in your stomach, typical anxiety symptoms. Also, so it's fear of just going out. Like, you need to exercise, you need to visit people or whatever now that we can, but you just don't want to. The fear is starting to take over. And it's almost like, I suppose, where we get to this extent of obsessively monitoring our health. If we hear a cough, and we all notice, we hear a cough now, and all of a sudden we're like, hang on a minute, how am I away from them? And the fear comes in. But when that fear is starting to be an ever-present thing on a daily basis, and you just feel that, look, there's this thing in the back of my mind that's niggling at us. I know for us men, for example, we're not great at talking about how we feel or what we're going through, but I've spoken with loads of people over the last while, men particularly, who they said, I've got this kind of anxious thing in the back of my head. I just don't know what it is. And obviously through talking. But I would say to anybody, look, professional help may be needed. And if so, it's always good to talk, because I always think talking is therapy, and a problem shared is a problem halved many of the times.
Mark, coronaphobia and all phobias will come under the umbrella of anxiety disorders, and while some would be familiar with their triggers and know how to manage them, others might be very new to this, might never have suffered from an anxiety disorder before, and therefore possibly would put it down to something else. They're too busy, they're too tired, without realising that actually it's a real issue. You mentioned there that you might need to seek professional help. Would it be cognitive behavioural therapy as an option, or what would you suggest?
Yeah, like CBT is something I'd be trained quite a lot in. And I have to say, whenever it comes to any phobia, or even if you're not sure what it is, like, don't go to Dr. Google. We all tend to do that, and we try and figure it all out ourselves. And it can be helpful to a degree, but sometimes you're better off just talk to someone, because you can actually misdiagnose yourself, you know. And even with the things we share today, don't take that as a diagnosis. Take it as something to, okay, that's a possibility, but I'll look into it further and speak to somebody. I think for a lot of us right now, you see, some people went into lockdown, never really experienced the levels of anxiety they've experienced before. And it's a horrific thing. It's debilitating. You know, I've shared in my podcast in previous episodes where a number of years ago I went through horrific anxiety, where I was literally the shell of a person. And from someone who was so confident to becoming that, and thankfully I was able to get through it and work through it. But I never understood what anxiety was until I experienced it myself. And that's what a lot of people are going through. They've had normal anxieties of life, but with what's happened as of late, they've gone to new heightened levels, and they may not even be sure of what exactly it is. Just they feel this, I'm not myself, I'm distracted, there's a knot in my stomach, I'm discontent, there's something going on here where I just don't feel, I feel on edge a little bit or agitated. And these are things that can kind of indicate, you know, if you've got a child or a partner, if they're a little bit agitated more than normal, these can always be telltale signs of anxiety. And like you mentioned, Laura, like, I suppose in many ways, coronaphobia, it is a health anxiety at the end of the day. That's what we put it under. It is like a phobia, but it is all come down to anxiety, which is the state we find ourselves in when we react to a fear or a perceived threat.
But Mark, in order to seek help, you know, without wanting to sound pedantic about it, but the person is going to have to leave the house to seek help, and that's the major stumbling block. So what help is available to them in their own home? What is the first step they should take? Are there people they can call? Are there people they can put an email into who will call them back just to have that initial conversation to build them up to getting the strength, particularly the mental strength, to open the front door and going to seek professional help then?
Yeah, and this is it. And it's very, like, as I say, sociophobia, agoraphobia, where the fear of leaving the house is so horrific, and it's a horrible ordeal. That's when a call to a GP is where I would always say is a first point of contact. I mean, a lot of people I'm working with now I'm working with them on Zoom. People who are like that, you know, panic attacks even have come in. They cannot leave their home because the fear is just too great, and it's been building over time. This doesn't just happen overnight. It can just start to build and start to ruminate over time. So reaching out to a GP is where I would say first and foremost. If you know a good qualified, you know, therapist, counselor, you know, definitely pursue that. I work from a life coaching perspective. So how I work is, if people come to me, I can sometimes point them in a direction that if they need professional help. So the point is, don't do nothing, do something. And one of the biggest parts of overcoming a fear, a phobia, or even any mental health disorder is, first of all, going, you know what, admit that there's something up, and then take on the approach of, I don't know how to fix it, I don't know what to do, but I'm going to do something, and take baby steps, even by just making an email to your GP, call your GP. A phone call can happen, you know, Zooms and Skypes can happen. Don't give up. There is always hope. And I always tell that to everybody, no matter how isolated or how you might feel like you're the only one in the world, there's always hope. There's always something you can do that. Always hope.
Mark, you've got a podcast, This Adult Life, that you mentioned earlier on, and actually the episode on coronaphobia is out today. But for those of us who perhaps don't quite meet the phobia sort of element to things, there are steps that we can take when all of us are feeling a little bit of anxiety about stepping out. Perhaps it might be meeting a very small number of people, because we haven't been socialising with friends in so long. So maybe just, you know, meeting up with one pal instead of the 4 or 5 you're allowed.
Exactly. I think that's, like, you hit the nail on the head there. That's exactly it. It's baby steps with everything. We may not be saying we've a coronaphobia, but definitely the fear element of the new norm. It's kind of like, you know, it's like we're submerging from a cave, and it's kind of like the world looks the same, but it's very different. You know, physically it's the same, but it's conducted very different, our day-to-day stuff. So baby steps is key. The first thing I always say to everyone, look, is take on, you know, a mindset of, look, I will get through this. As I said earlier on, I will have hope. I'm going to get through this. Baby steps, and work at a pace that suits you. Getting over any phobia, exposure therapy is very, very prevalent, and that's where you're exposed to what you fear bit by bit. A little example, for example, you know, you might be, if someone has a fear of spiders, you might start introducing them to a photograph of a spider, then maybe a video of a spider, then maybe a trip to a zoo or whatever. I'm just using that as an example.
As you say, baby steps are the key, and there is help out there. Listen, Mark, we appreciate your time. You can, of course, find out more on the topic of coronaphobia on Mark Fennell's latest podcast, This Adult Life. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks so much, Mark. After the break, a traditional Indian dish that'll save you reaching for the takeaway menu tonight. We're up in the kitchen next.